But I kept hearing God say, I'm with you. I obviously wanted to hear God say, I'm with you and I'm going to heal you and it's going to be okay. All I heard was pretty much, I'm with you. And that was okay for a while because I wanted that. But I remember there was a certain point that it was kind of like, but I want more than that. I don't want to die early. I don't want to die within a few months. Um, and finally realizing slowly and gradually through this process that God being with me was actually the best thing there was. Um, it was not a consolation prize.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We are here again today with two of our special guests. Laurie and Bill Lokey are joining us. Hopefully you saw our earlier podcast in which that we had a great conversation about the various aspects of trauma. And we've asked Laurie and Bill to join us again today with Greg Miller, our host, to continue this the conversation about trauma.
Yes. And in fact, for this podcast, we're going to ask you, Bill and Laurie, to get a little bit more personal about your own story and journey. Because I did listen to another podcast that you did, and you talked very openly about a journey that you are on with cancer. And there was just some truth that you spoke in that was incredibly meaningful. And so if you're open, we would just love to kind of hear about this journey that you've been on and where you are with all of that.
Yeah, thank you very much again for having us, for letting us be on here with you all. We appreciate your all's work. Yes. So we were going along, I guess, as most people in life, thinking that since my parents lived to be in their 90s, I assumed that that was going to be somewhere in the vicinity of probably where I went. And a little over 4.5 years, or a little bit less than 4.5 years ago, I got the diagnosis of prostate cancer. And my urologist at the time, when we found out the PSA levels, which was one of the markers, was rising, he said, even if it is prostate cancer, oftentimes we just wait and watch. It doesn't grow very quickly. It's usually not a problem most of the time. So when we got back the biopsy 2 days later, he said, I'm really sorry to tell you, this is the most aggressive cancer that there is. This is the kind that kills people. And you got to do something really quickly. So long story short, I started looking at places to go, went actually somewhere out of town and began the journey of working at cancer at M.D. Anderson, but going and we would go almost every 3 weeks to Houston just to do some sort of treatment. And I did several clinical trials, went through a chemotherapy about 1.5 years ago, and now I'm doing the second round of a chemotherapy. But it was amazing what happens when you hear that kind of news. Mm-hmm. As I've said, don't worry, there's nothing that can prepare you for the news of your death. It's like there is this shock that you go through, and then you have to begin to look at what does this mean, and what if I die early? And so finally, back in October of 2021, my oncologist said that you're pretty much kind of at the end of the rope of treatments, and you'll probably have about 3 to 6 months left to live. Yesterday or day before yesterday was the 6-month point, so I'm on extra time now. The chemotherapy that I'm on now has actually helped. It's kind of pushed back the cancer, it seems. The chemotherapy, man, you don't want to be on that if you don't have to be, but I have to be because it has its own side effects. That's because of my illustrious hair now. but I lost it all, and it's actually growing back. So the side effects of chemo are really rough, but the side effects of the cancer are worse. But what I found is that there was this period of time of trying to deal with that kind of news, and then beginning to deal with, okay, what's it going to be like maybe to die early? Um, and as we walked through this journey for over 4 years, I kept hearing God say to me, when I would really be praying, and we began a very dedicated every morning kind of devotional time for us that really, really has made a difference. But I kept hearing God say, I'm with you. I obviously wanted to hear God say, I'm with you and I'm going to heal you and it's going to be okay. All I heard was pretty much, I'm with you. And that was okay for a while because I wanted that. But I remember there was a certain point that it was kind of like, but I want more than that. I don't want to die early. I don't want to die within a few months. Um, and finally realizing slowly and gradually through this process of this intimacy with God that I was developing and Laurie was developing and we were together, that God being with me was actually the best thing there was. It was not a consolation prize. It was not, well, if you can't have anything else, at least God's with you. Began to realize that God being with me was the best thing that could possibly happen. And I began to find that I began to have to depend more and more and more upon God getting me through this day when we had no idea what was going to happen. And the fear that we've had to walk through, we continue to walk through. There'll be times when we are with each other and we just cry our eyes out to go, she'll be like, I don't want you to die early. There'll be other times that we make jokes about it and we laugh and we can kid each other. You just walk through that, but through it all, God has been very, very present. And then one of the things I think that was most significant for me and for us in this was when I got the news that it was like 3 to 6 months, more than likely, the doctor said, I want you to begin to tell your kids that this past Christmas will be your last Christmas. And so we began to share that news with my kids, and we began to share, that with people. And then I began to find that in January, that our kids sometimes would be talking to her about a trip maybe they were wanting to do in the future, and they were talking to her about going, but they were beginning to make plans without me. Mm-hmm. And I remember one night it really kind of hurt my feelings. I was like, wait a minute, what is this? And then I realized, wait a minute, they are doing exactly what I've been preparing them to do. Mm-hmm. They're preparing to live life without me. And the next morning we got up and listened to a Bible study by a Bible study leader here in Nashville that we love to listen to. And it was on Romans chapter 12, the first couple of verses. And part of it was around God transforming us. And it hit me, and I really believe this was that Holy Spirit work that happens, that God doesn't transform the dead, he transforms the living. Mm-hmm. And it began to hit me really strong that I believed it was not God's will for me to prepare for death. God wants me to prepare for living, whether it's this life or the next life. But both of them are living. And moving from life to life is what moving from this life to eternity is, I believe. And so it was beginning to realize that, wait a minute, I want to prepare to continue to live, whether it's on this earth or in the new heaven and the new earth. But God's going to be transforming me either place, either time, and regardless of even, I may die still at the same time physically, but the death is not something that I have to dread, but instead it's literally moving into life that's actually more life than this life is. And God's not done with me yet. And so realizing that renewal, that God's transforming work is something that I get to continue to look forward to, is like, what's God going to do with me, with us now? Maybe in the next few months, we'll get to be some of our best work ever. And that has really changed something inside of me. But I think all of that process was important to understand.
Well, and
from the very
no, go ahead, Laurie.
then we were, yeah, okay. From the very, very beginning, God had prepared me, and I was at a training on going deeper in a spiritual realm of prayer. And I was in my hotel room, and I was reading about Lazarus, and God just said to me, he's going to get, and from there, I was going to have to go to M.D. Anderson and drive 12 hours from Abilene, Texas to Houston, Texas. And he said, he's going to get really sick. But his sickness is not going to be unto death, and it's going to be for my glory. And from the very beginning, God has let us know that this is for he is going to be glorified through this sickness, through this suffering. And then later, I thought, well, he's not going to die physically. But for me, I was able to surrender and let go. Death, where's your death? Where's your sting, death? Because it's not going to be about death. It is going to be about life after life. And he is going to, the sickness is not going to be unto death, because he's going to continue to live on through eternity. So all the doors that I become afraid of are actually great doors. Like Jesus could come back. That's a good option. He could live on eternally with Jesus. That's a good option. Or he could be healed. So all three are places of being able to come to that place of acceptance.
And it doesn't mean that we aren't still afraid at times.
Right.
It doesn't mean that it's all like, oh, it's just wonderful, we skip along. We still go through all the grief and all the fears and different things. But there is a real difference in knowing this isn't going to, the end of all of this isn't going to be death.
Well, the quote,
the beauty of knowing that you've been saved.
Yes.
The quote that I heard you say that was so meaningful is that God's presence isn't the consolation prize. And that just is such a beautiful way to say it, that there are times when we have very specific requests, we have very specific prayers, and they are not realized in the way that we had hoped. And so to recognize that, for those listeners who are struggling because they have been praying for something that's not been manifested in the way that they had hoped, that there is still a comfort that comes from God's presence. And even as you're talking about the transition, it's the transition from God's presence to God's presence. The more that we are able to experience God's presence here, the more it prepares us for God's presence there. And so as we are able to open ourselves up to that, that is where we're going to find comfort. And I'm so glad that you just named that this doesn't rescue you from grief. It doesn't keep you from experiencing the pain. It doesn't mean there won't be chaos towards the end and after that. It's just that there is a overarching hope that we do not have to be alone in the midst of the pain itself.
That's right.
And because the prostate cancer metastasized into metastatic bone cancer, there will be pain. I remember my doctor kept saying, okay, have you got any pain here? And have you got any pain here? And he was curious. And I have had some back pain in the lower back where one of the cancer places are. It's been, in moments, it's been some of the worst pain I've ever felt in my life. So it doesn't take away the physical or the emotional pain. It's still there. But I do want to say, I'm glad you brought that up. I do want to say that people, if anyone's listening, that you have prayed, you've cried out to God, you've been on your knees, and it feels like God's not listening, or it feels like there's no answer. I want to just say that an immediate answer is not a prerequisite to God's existence. there were times when, Israel was waiting and waiting and waiting and crying out and praying. And yet we know what the end of some of those stories were, that God would come back around and rescue and bring about. But those were still about God saying, I want their hearts, and their hearts are not with me. Now, it doesn't mean that when God doesn't answer our prayers, that it doesn't mean that our heart is not with God. I don't know all of the outcomes or the reasons. I don't know what's going on in the heavenlies or in this earthly place. I don't know what's going on. Just like our 4-year-old grandson doesn't know what's going on when we tell him he's got to do something sometimes. But what we know is that there is this Father. There is this also Jesus, who has been here and knows what it feels like to be in all of the hurt and the temptations. And we know and we believe that he is really good, and that there is going to be an understanding one day that when we'll get to see at life after life, we'll finally get to see from God's perspective and go, oh, now I understand what was going on. And the whole time, God, I was so angry, or I was so scared, or whatever. And I think we will get to see that day when we go, oh, okay. And then we'll understand. But in the meantime, it's continuing to cry out, to continuing to grieve, whatever it is, have our real hearts present with God, and then to keep waiting on, keep praying to God, and we will understand someday. But in the meantime, there are moments we'll hear from God, I believe. Some of us sometimes more than others. I'm not sure exactly why. But there will be times that we get little bits of understanding where we go, but most importantly, when we hear God say, or we feel that presence of God with us, is to go, okay, I can walk through the valley of the shadow of death if I know that you're walking with me, because I trust you.
And, many of a time when I see him suffering, or his pain is so intense that I would have to cry out to God and say, God, help my unbelief. Give me the faith. And I don't believe either one of us have manufactured the faith or pulled up our bootstraps. I believe God has given us the faith to continue to believe that he's good, but I believe it's our invitation for him to do so. Like, God, open my heart to continue to believe in the midst of hard and in the midst of suffering. And every day, at the end of the day, I look back on the day and go, wow, I didn't believe I was going to get through this day. I didn't believe we were going to get through this day, but God has gotten us through by giving us the faith to continue to have his presence and to know him.
Well, and Laurie, you made reference to the story of Lazarus, and that's one of the things that we teach at the workshop. And one of the things I think is so significant in that story is there is a statement of cause and effect. And it says that Jesus did love Lazarus and Mary and Martha, therefore he delayed. And many times we interpret that God must not love me because he doesn't respond the way I requested, or because Jesus delays. But in that particular passage, there's this clear understanding that it was because of God's love, it was because of Jesus's love for this family that he delayed. And I love that the idea that you mentioned the mystery, that we have to surrender to the mystery. And many of us want to find comfort in absolute certainty. And if that's the case, we'll never find comfort. But if we can find comfort in a Jesus that delays and mysteries that we don't understand, then that's where we're going to find the ultimate comfort that makes it possible for us to navigate the chaos and pain of life.
Yeah, and I love in that story of Lazarus, and I don't have my Bible right out in front of me now, and I don't remember which verse, but after it's said, talks about what's happening at the tomb, and Jesus is there, and it says, Jesus wept as he saw what was taking place in the grief that those who loved Lazarus were grieving. He wept because he was with them, But then there was also this one little verse, and I've forgotten exactly what it says, but he was moved in spirit, or he was disturbed. And we've had a couple of people in their teaching say that there is not actually a really, really great Greek English word that matches what that word meant, that Jesus was moved or disturbed in spirit. And he said one of the best ways to acknowledge it or to see it would be being out on the storm on the ocean in a boat, and the waves are huge and it's terrifying, but it's this storm, and it's that Jesus had this anger, or Jesus had this inside of him when he's looking at this, and basically was feeling that this is not the way it's meant to be.
Mm-hmm.
This is not the way it's going to be. Not only with death and decay, but also with the grief and the tears of losing someone in death. And then Jesus raises him from the dead, in a sense, to say, I want to show you what it was meant to be like.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very helpful for us sometimes, to know that while the terrible is still going on in the world or in our lives, but that Jesus, instead of being just this calm, easygoing, like, well, it's just the way it is, that Jesus inside felt the anguish and the pain of watching people suffer, and to know this is not the way I want it to be. It's this way right now because of the fall, but there will be a time where there won't be death, decay, there won't be tears, and that is helpful for us to also know that tells us more about Jesus' heart.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that.
November of 2020, my son-in-law, who lives about 5 minutes away, was in a mountain bike accident and paralyzed from the chest down, and he's got 5 children. And we remember the phone call, and I had to drive home from Texas all the way to Tennessee. And I remember in the cry out, because I was getting calls that he might not make it, he's in surgery, those kind of things. And as I was praying and praising and praying and praising, I could feel at one point where God's anger, like it was never meant to be this way.
Mm-hmm.
I could feel his anger with me in that accident. Now, the glorious thing is that he's, right now, again, on his second time at Shepherd, doing some rehabilitation, and is doing really well. But knowing in the midst of the hard, because we can think of levels of hard, and I thought it was hard enough that we had been in Texas, finishing up for 2 months of time living there for treatments, to finish on his last week, with this tragic accident. But we can see again in the hard that there's always presence and capacity to get through the hard, and to be able to trust him in those places that we could have never imagined.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I always say, don't ever go down that road, because we don't have the grace for it. When it does happen, it's there. We feel it. We know he's with us.
Yeah.
For many of our listeners, many of them, they're in a journey of recovery with a spouse. And one of the things I'm always aware of is at the beginning of the recovery journey, we have this promise of everything that recovery is going to bring us. And the longer we are in recovery, we begin to realize there's some things that we will not be given back or cannot be restored. And so for that person that, they were hoping that their marriage would be saved, or that their spouse would choose recovery and be sober, and they're kind of in the chaos of realizing maybe their prayers were not answered in the way that they had hoped, just to be reminded that God's presence in that chaos and that pain isn't the consolation prize. And when those prayers and those cries aren't realized the way that we had hoped, that we are not alone in that, and there is comfort in God's presence. Is there anything that you would want to say to someone who is in that space?
Absolutely. And there are things from I mean, there's still sadness in my heart about going through a divorce and not having my family, family of origin intact, or the mom, dad, children. There's still grief and loss in that. And yet I see the beauty of how God's redemption and how he makes things new. And I believe even in that grief and loss that he will make things new. He will for eternity, they will be given back all these things that have been stolen from us. But we're not gonna get that in this lifetime. So I look forward to my first husband and I being able to see each other without having the trauma in between us and the conflict in between us and the addiction in between us. And so I look forward to seeing him again, to all the decisions that I've made, all the losses that I've made. I look forward to all of that being made new forever in eternity.
One of the things I've learned also through this cancer journey is don't keep carrying keys to doors where you no longer live. There is this thing that when something is shifted or I've lost something that's very precious to me, if I keep demanding that life be the way it used to be or the way that I thought it was supposed to be, I will never be able to experience acceptance and actually the blessing that might come that God leads me in this new area or in this new place of life. Once I've accepted the loss and keep moving forward with God. There is this saying that is pretty rampant in recovery that's expectations are premeditated resentments. And when I expect that life is going to turn out a certain way, or that I don't have to live as a cancer patient, or that my marriage is going to be healed, or whatever it is, if I keep demanding that, I will live in resentment. I'll wall off my heart and I will miss the gifts that God can give me. But if I can let go and grieve, it doesn't mean you just accept. We have to go through the grief process, which includes anger and includes a lot of things. But there's finally a place of the acceptance of, okay, this is where I am. God, how do we live daily through this now? Then I can begin to be open to actually seeing and receiving some of the gifts that actually may become better. And one of the things we say now is, I hate cancer, but I wouldn't want to live without some of the things I've learned from cancer, because it has truly enriched our lives, the learnings and the wisdom and the relationship with God that has grown through it.
Well, and even I like who
Bill,
I am becoming through this, that the cancer is shaping and forming me in ways that I like who I am becoming. And that in itself is part of the gift.
Right.
Yes.
But not being defined by cancer.
Right. Exactly.
Like we're defined by Christ.
Right.
We want to live being defined by Christ, and cancer is just the thing that we have to deal with every day. Yeah.
Well, once again, Bill and Laurie, we want to sincerely thank you for sharing your story and your time with us. It's been a real blessing for us and for our listeners and viewers to hear your story. It's inspirational, and we hope that it has helped many others that are in their own have their own struggles, their own trauma, their own story. It's been just a blessing to us to have you share that with us today. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Having us.
Thank you for
You bet. And for our listeners, thank you so much. Greg, did you have a closing statement you wanted to make?
No, that was great. Thank you.
Okay. Well, with that in mind, we'd like to thank you for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. We hope that this coming week is going to be a week for you that's just filled with many blessings and with great vision.